Major funding for the rise and fall of Jim Crow is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding America's understanding for more than 30 years of who we were, who we are, and who we will be. And by support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people. Additional funding is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Corporate support is made possible by New York Life.
With vision and determination, one generation dreamed of creating a better world for the next. New York Life is proud to bring you remarkable stories of dedication, struggle, and triumph.
On the eve of World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt sardonically notes, "The South is changing, but don't press too hard." Within its borders live some 4 million black and white farmers, most of whom work somebody else's land, still using mules instead of tractors. Of its 4 million elementary school-age children, 1.5 million will be condemned to a life of illiteracy. The South is still ruled by a few corporations, politicians, and planners whose courteous style masks an iron fist. White supremacy is the law of the land. Black Americans are subjugated by a system of racial laws and customs called Jim Crow.
The whole world in which I was raised in Georgia in the 30s and the early 40s, the whole world was one of rigid Jim Crow and segregation.
Laborers, what could you do all day? Where did they go to the bathroom? Where did they get a drink of water? Something as elemental as that. Not a lunch counter, just water.
Well, this particular day I was going to Tupelo, and I looked up at the top of the house right on the street there, and I could see it was burning. So I ran to the front door and knocked, and his white neighborhood, of course. The woman came, "What do you mean talking? Come into my front door." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I said, "I was going to tell you that your house is on fire." She said, "Wait a minute, come."
We could play together at home. My mother and mothers could fix their food, wash their dirty clothes, and watch over the little boys and girls while their parents went wherever they wanted to go, but we couldn't go and sit with them.
It was very hard for me to be sitting on a bus and a white man get on that bus, a drunken white bum, and tell me, "Nigger, get up and give me that seat." I can remember times when I said to myself, it's time to die. It's time to go to hell. And then I'd realize, it's not it. Because if you didn't get up and give that white bum that seat, that bus driver would stop that bus and come back and start whooping you with a club and then the police near, and you were just in some serious trouble.
I knew that a change would come about in the South just as a change would come about in the North. And I was thinking within my mind, hopefully it will not be bloodshed, but someone would have to bring this change about.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
With the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, change had come, not just for black Americans, but for all Americans. Roosevelt's promise to keep America out of World War II could not be kept. America's machinery of war was forced into high gear.
with confidence in the unfounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
By the thousands, Southern blacks migrated north to produce the instruments of war, and thousands of black men and women would leave their segregated society to fight in a segregated army. The war would become the transforming experience of their lives.
The army at that time, it gave me a certain air about myself. I became a platoon sergeant.
We were exhibiting something that had not been shown before.
I really was proud of being in a tank battalion.
I remember nights after those guys would be engaged, and we were waiting for the guys to come back from the front lines. And you could hear that tank company coming in at night. And each driver had a way of what you call gassing his truck, his tank. You say, that's John, that's Jim, that's whoever. They took pride in what they did. They were gallant men.
Now, I remember a young white fellow come up to me. He said, how did they let y'all have them tanks? And that stung me to the very heart when he said that. I said, we trained for them. We had the ability to use them and use them in warfare.
As they proved their ability to fight, African American soldiers also challenged racial stereotypes. And even as they fought to end the tyranny of the Nazi occupation of Europe, they discovered another terrible face of racism.
I did happen to see it one time on a side road, our railroad truck, a railroad car that was filled with Jews. Their bones were just, could see their bones, their skin, Their eyes were just recessed in their head, the cheekbones, the teeth and everything. You look at them and you just couldn't believe that that was a human being. The black soldiers, some of them cried like babies when they saw this. I did, It was just beyond the thought of how a human being could do what they did to those people. And after all, the Jews, their complexion, they were Caucasians, huh? So if they did that to them, what could they do to us, huh? And we were hated and disliked by the Germans, especially Hitler. But that was things that we understood. And we just had to put it in the back burner and continue to do what we had to do.
While the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion are horrified by German atrocities, elsewhere in Europe, African American soldiers are experiencing a warmth and acceptance unknown to them at home.
The French had a certain kind of openness and warmth that they exhibited to the minorities that's just unexplainable.
In the nightclubs of Paris, the soldiers enjoyed that acceptance, breaking one of the deepest taboos ingrained in them from childhood.
My mother would tell me over and over and over again, Roscoe, don't you be looking at them white girls. And she would have a look on her face that was peculiar. And it never dawned on me to say to her, why? Why, Mama?
We were in a nightclub, and there was a group of soldiers there, and we were having fun, laughing, and the white soldiers became jealous of it, I suppose, and they tried to pick some kind of ruckus, to the extent to where I had to go and talk to the sergeant, who was the highest ranking person with that group. And he says, well, if you was back if you was in the United States, you wouldn't be having anything to do with these white girls. I said, well, you call them white girls, I say they're French girls as far as I'm concerned.
And I think that's what changed most of the black servicemen, the Negro servicemen. They found out that other people treat us different from our own people. And that's why most of us were so determined when we got back home to be treated fairly.
The South to which the veterans returned is not the South they had left. The old agrarian rural South is being dramatically replaced by an urban industrial one. Signs of the new prosperity are everywhere. But for the returning black veterans, there are other painfully familiar signs as well.
I thought pressure would be gone, or eliminated, or stopped when I got back. But I found that it was not.
I was standing out in front of the bank, waiting on it to open. And two white men were there. And one of them said, I reckon now all the Negroes will be coming back, I guess. And the other one said, yeah. And the other one said, well, I guess we'll have to put them all back in their places. That's what he did. And he said, yep. He answered 3 or 4 times before he stopped saying yep.
They gave us 45 days leave out of Camp Shanks, New York again. And we got in Americus, Georgia, the hometown of Jimmy Carter, ex-President Jimmy Carter. Had to change the buses there. Blacks could not go in the bus station. And if you wanted to purchase anything from the snack bar, it was a window, and you would peck on that window, and this lady was open this window and sell you if she wanted to. And I tried to get her to give me a glass of water. She would never give me, she just ignored me. And I didn't go in, but I tried to lean inside and get me a cup of water. And those white people beat me till I was unconscious. I was in the Army uniform, had all these medals. And that's one thing you thought they would have respected. And they beat me until they thought I was dead, called a black undertaker, who picked me up and found I had a pulse and still breathing, and carried me to a hospital there in Thomasville, Georgia, that still exists today. And I laid there crying for 8 weeks, wishing Adolf Hitler had won the war.
They were very bitter in that they had to come back to being second-class citizens after having risked their lives for their country.
Hell, if I got to fight, if we got to fight and die for America, why should we be treated like slaves in America? If we got to fight and die for America, just like the white boys, why can't we enjoy the same rights that white boys?
I just came back and wanted to enjoy things that we've been told we're fighting for. I wanted to rest and vote. You know, we realized that all the hardship we had came from elected officials. The mayor, the Board of Aldermen, the Superintendent of Education.
The way to get rid of Jim Crow was through the political process. That was the only way to do it, which it was.
But it was a dangerous thing for blacks to try to vote. And that, you know, power was involved, status was involved. And, you know, whites knew that if blacks voted en masse, then white politicians would respond to black concern.
To the diminutive United States Senator from Mississippi, Theodore Bilbo, blacks had no right to vote. He once boasted that he used the word nigger 77 times in one 20-minute speech.
Bilbo is partly responsible for whatever Mac and I became. We were little old boys. Bill was running for office. He come to our town, Decatur. hollering, screaming, nigger this and nigger that, and you better kill all, send all niggas back to Africa, and all that kind of silly stuff. So we'd always go to hear him. For some reason, I love to hear him talk. No one ain't gonna call us niggas, but I want to hear because I know he's just crazy. So we'd go up there, and this particular time, I can never forget. We had an old courthouse where it had stair steps like that, and had a pillar up here. And Bill was a little old short punk, he must have been about 5 feet something, I guess. And Bill had to get up on the podium, and up on that platform to speak. He looked down and saw us. You see them two little niggas sitting down there? If you don't stop them someday, they'll be up here. Said, let them go to Washington represent you. And McLean said, you know, Charlie, that ain't a bad idea. And that was and we just looked at him. He just kept looking and snorting and going on. And talking about what you got to do to them. Visit the night before election if they go try to vote.
You see, in some counties, blacks outnumber whites, and in Mississippi particularly. So they saw the handwriting on the wall. They knew what was going to happen, and that's why they intimidated people, did everything they could to try and keep them from voting.
The biggest thing was the non-legal, the coercive thing, the intimidation, the fear. Klan riding about you, your house at night. And if you were active in voter registration, you were in serious trouble.
As the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia is determined to oppose black demands by any and all means, Stetson Kennedy, a Southern labor journalist, infiltrates the Klan equally determined to expose its deeds.
The Klan was very actively engaged in trying to deter black voting. They resorted to such things as placing miniature coffins on doorsteps and mailing bullets through the mail to black would-be voters. People were indeed killed at the polls and at the registrars. There was Professor Alvin Jones in New Orleans, for example, who led some of his colleagues to a street to go register to vote, and he was beaten to death in the registrar's office.
Violence and the threat of violence deterred many, but not everyone.
Went to vote that day. We had 5 of us go, and I said, look, now we're going to vote no matter what happened. We got there, I mean, all the white I've known all my life. I couldn't believe that. Mr. Andy May, all kind of. I looked at them, and we got there, had the room blocked off. We couldn't get there. When I had guns, shotguns, and rifles, and hell just got in me. And I just walked up to him. I said, get out the way like that. And Mecca said, no, Charles. I said, no, I'm going to arrest. And then a little white lady, I'll never forget that, came out there and said, Charles, not now. Your day will come. Look me dead now. I said, not now. See, it's just not now. She said, your day will come. I said, no, man, I won't arrest you. I'm going to vote today. And old Andy May said, if you vote, you'll be a dead nigga. I said, well, kill me now, then, you SOB. And she said, no, Charles, please, not now. And Medgar was right behind me. Then the other blacks had stopped at the day, wouldn't come no further. And Lope said, come on, Charles, let's get out of here. So we come back. And then he grabbed me by the arm. I said, no, don't do that. I said, no. I said, I don't let him know. Ain't nobody scared of y'all. Look dead in the eye. You know what Dad told us? Look a Peckerwood in the eye, and he can't do a thing. Just don't back up. And he could hear a rat piss on cotton. And we just backed on out and went on down the street.
In Atlanta, Georgia, John Wesley Dobbs, the head of Georgia's Black Masons, knew the potential power in the black vote. For almost a decade, Dobbs had preached the gospel of the ballot, the book, and the buck to Georgia's black community. When 10,000 Negroes get registered, he said, the signal light of opportunity will automatically change from red to green. In 1944, when the Supreme Court declared the white-only primary unconstitutional, Dobbs knew the time had come to act.
My father used his fraternal organization, the Black Masons, to try and get black people all over the state registered.
He was preparing people to get the ballot and to get involved in political participation. And this involved an insight, involved wisdom. When the opportunity presents itself, You got to be ready.
My father told them that if they were going to be Masons, they had to do it. And they could vote then. But the local people didn't want them to register even. And in this one county, they found out what was happening, that my father was sending these people. Then they tried to get at him. One night, very, very late, well, someone rang the doorbell, and my father, he looked out, and there was this sheriff's car from some county, this county. They had driven several hundred miles from this little place to come up there in the middle of the night now. And I'm sure they had no warrant or anything, and they wanted him to let them in. Well, he wasn't beginning to let them in, you know. Then after a while, when they saw they couldn't get in, they went on back. But to drive all that distance, think they were going to come in there, they were going to kidnap him and lynch him. I'm sure that if he'd opened the door, they were going to take him back down there and kill him.
You could not be a person of color in this country with any self-respect without ultimately recognizing that you had to find a way to confront this terrorism, this act of indiscriminately taking people of color and lynching them. You could put up with a lot of things. You could redefine a lot of things. You could sort of reinterpret a lot of the social structures that were part of Jim Crow. But lynching was one of those things that was just too clear an insult to the integrity of every person of color, to the security of every person of color, to ignore. It made resistance inevitable.
Risking rejection, violence, and even death, black voters went to the polls. Their votes provide the margin of victory for Atlanta's Helen Douglas Mankin, a political moderate over her conservative opponent.
And of course, you know, we were just eager to latch on to anyone who provided some moderation, to give us just a little dignity, a little meaning in our lives, a little support, encouragement. So we were all excited about Helen Douglas Mankin.
While blacks were excited, white supremacists were outraged. Eugene Talmadge, seeking a third term as governor of Georgia, builds his campaign around restoring the white primary.
Eugene Talmadge was, I would say, the political Adolf Hitler of Georgia. I remember him coming to Bainbridge during the campaign. And really, he would be talking about something significant. The white people tell us about the niggers, Eugene, tell us about the niggers.
I say it's the law this year, and some of the niggers will vote. The fewer the better. But I add to it this: if I'm your governor, they won't vote in our white primary the next 4 years. Yeah.
My mother and I guess other sisters were in the dining room, and Talmadge was speaking. He said, "Nigger." And my mother walked over to the radio and cut it off. And she said, "Not in my house." And I just loved it. I mean, I didn't know what it was, but she suddenly made us protected and safe and dignified.
In July of 1946, Talmadge's racially virulent campaign rhetoric adds fuel to the racial fires already burning in rural Walton County, Georgia.
I was working at the ice house, and some white people come there. They had guns, and had ropes. They had all those things down there, and they was in there showing how to make a loop on the rope or to hang a person.
On the afternoon of July 25th, 1946, Loy Harrison, a white man, was driving two black men and their wives home from Monroe, Georgia. Harrison had just bailed one of the black men out of jail, Roger Malcolm, who had just been arrested for assaulting his white landlord. The other black man in the car was Malcolm's brother-in-law, George Dorsey.
George came home from the Army in '45,
And I met him way down the road down there and walked him all the way home. And he was telling me about being in the Army. He had some medals on. He was real proud of that.
At sunset on July 25th, 10-year-old Clinton Adams and a friend were playing by the river at Moore's Ford Bridge.
We seen Mr. Laura Harrison, his old big old black car. Seen him go down the road. And didn't think nothing about it. About one car, Dave might go through there.
And when he got along this spot here, he didn't have access to the bridge because they had a car blocking the bridge. One car came up from behind. The mob, about 15 or 20 armed white men, came out of the woods and out of the cars that was parked down here.
We seen them down there fighting with some white men. We didn't know what was going on at the time being, so we just laid down right side the field there, right on the edge of it. And then we seen it was the Klans, because we knew some of them. And we said, they're going to whoop them. Well, that's what the Klan done, whoop people, you know. And it doesn't matter whether you're black or white. If they take an oath and whoop your butt, you're gonna get one. And they tied up George's hands.
And once they started into the wooded area with them, Dorothy, from what Laura Harrison said, yelled out, "Don't kill him," and she called the name of one of the people that she recognized. Then the order was given to go back to the car and get the 2 young black ladies that was in the car.
And they pushed and shoved them and knocked them around. And all at once, these 4 guys, they just come up there and they pull guns and bang. And everything went into slow motion to me. And they started shooting, people standing up over them, shooting down on them, people were shooting in the trees, bullet was going every which way. They was on the ground, and I was shaking so bad till I couldn't move, I couldn't stay on the ground, I was just shaking that bad. And then when the shooting stopped, everything went silent, nothing, just quiet. And I stood up, and when I stood up, I was just like, you know, right there. And George, I knew him, I looked at him closest, I reckon, because he was my good buddy. And you could see the smoke and the air bubbling out, and their faces were just a mess. I mean, it was literally shot to pieces.
Malcolm and Dorsey's wives were both pregnant.
Dorothy was between 7 and 8 months pregnant. May was around 3 months pregnant. So we lost 6 lives at Moore's Ford that day.
I went over there and they were lying there and laying around, and I picked up a rope. I was a 22-year-old kid. And this man next to me said, "Son, let me have that." He jerked it out of my hand. And of course, I gave it to him. But I looked over and a pool of blood there and picked up a tooth and brought it back home and gave it to a friend of mine, and she put it on a good luck charm.
My partner and I covered the autopsy. And we stood and watched this rather awesome experience where they had to use an axe to open up the chest, where they had to use these prongs to remove slugs and pellets from the body.
I went down to the funeral home and looked at them, and that was one of the wrong things I shouldn't have never done. They just swole up and beat up. It was just awful.
We obtained no help from the sheriff's department. We received no help from the local police department.
2 or 3 days later, the sheriff was asking Mama questions about it, and I was just sitting on the porch. And I said, I know who done it. Big mouth me on, let him know right quick. And he said, come here, boy. So I went over to him. And he said, I want to tell you something. He said, I can put some of these people in jail, but I can't put all of them. And if they found out you know what you know, it could come back on you, your mama, your sister, or your brother. And he said, the best thing you can ever do is never mention this again.
Rumors spread through the white community that 18-year-old Lamar Howard has told the police he had seen a mob gather at the ice house before the killings.
Next day, I went back to the ice house, and these 2 white fellas asked me, well, what'd you tell them? I didn't tell them nothing because I didn't know nothing to tell them. And then they kept on questioning, I know you told them. What did you tell them? You better tell me. If you don't tell me, I'm going to kill you. And he pulled the hammer back on that gun and pointed right in my face, about this close to you. And that bear looked like it was that big. But I still didn't tell him anything. I said, I don't know nothing, I can't tell you. And then they tried everything they could around there. Then one told the other one, he said, oh, let him go home. He don't know nothing, he don't know nothing. He said, now I'm gonna tell you, you go home, you don't stop to talk to nobody, and don't do anything, you go straight home. I have had nightmares. I would go to bed at night. I'd be scared somebody would come up there and get me. I even changed my name from Lamar Howard to Lamar Jones for a long time.
Although Lloyd Harrison was the FBI's prime suspect in the killings, no one was ever charged, let alone tried and convicted for the murders.
And I asked him, I said, Mr. Lloyd, I said, why did them people kill George and Doris? He said, well, before George went to the service, he was a pretty good nigger. But after he got out, he thought he was as good as any white man.
Truman was just outraged by the shooting of 4 blacks in Walton County, Georgia, and the fact that servicemen returning from World War II had been attacked. And he agreed in June of 1947 to address the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
With his back to the Lincoln Memorial, Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, becomes the first president to ever address the NAACP.
The extension of civil rights today means not protection of the people against the government, but protection of the people by the government.
At the Democratic Convention in 1948, Truman goes further. Pressured by Northern black voters and civil rights activists, he endorses a strong civil rights platform, placing his own candidacy at risk.
There was this strong sentiment, these are states' rights, these are local matters. So far as Truman was concerned, that wasn't getting us anyplace. The federal government had to move.
30 rebellious Southerners storm out in protest.
Strom Thurmond, who was the leader of the segregationists, was approached by a reporter after he had led these 4 state delegations out, and he was asked, how come you did this when President Truman is doing precisely the same thing that Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in terms of support of civil rights? And Thurmond turned to the reporter and immediately responded, yes, but there's a difference. Truman really means it.
Outraged by Truman's action, Strom Thurmond, governor of South Carolina, challenges him for the presidency under the banner of the newly formed States' Rights Party.
The Southern revolt against President Truman reaches its climax at Birmingham under the States' Rights banner. More than 6,000 flocked to the Rump Convention to join in the protest against the President's Civil Rights program. 13 Southern states are represented in the uproarious session which precedes the nomination of Governors Thurmond of South Carolina and Fielding Wright of Mississippi as party standard bearers. Governor Thurmond attacks the civil rights plank.
It simply means that it's another effort on the part of the President to dominate the country by force and to put into effect these uncalled for and these damnable proposals he has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights. And I'll tell you, the American people from one side or the other had better wake up and oppose such a program, and if they don't, the next thing will be a totalitarian state in these United States.
The battle lines were drawn. 10 days later, after being pressured by black labor leader A. Philip Randolph, Truman signs Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces. It was a dream fulfilled for Randolph, who had been fighting to integrate the Army for over a decade. In 1941, Randolph had threatened to march on Washington if then-President Roosevelt did not desegregate the armed forces and change government hiring practices.
A. Philip Randolph, who was head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, members throughout the country advised the president that if he didn't do it, he would bring over 10,000 of his members to Washington to march in protest.
This scared Washington. You know, and Roosevelt realized he needed to do something to buy Randolph off. Roosevelt sent his wife, Eleanor, to meet with A. Philip Randolph to get the march called off.
As we were gearing up to fight a war against fascism, this would not be a good thing for the president to have happen.
With all due respect, Mr. President, I thought I might say on the part of the Negro people, they feel they are not wanted in the armed forces of this country. They are feeling that they are being shunted about. A. Philip Randolph.
Under pressure to act, President Roosevelt makes a concession.
At the 11th hour, the last minute, President Roosevelt issued an executive order, 8802, which established the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which basically said that there could not be any discrimination in hiring practices in the defense industry. Admitting his fear of Southern reprisal, Roosevelt had stopped short of meeting all of Randolph's demands. Truman did not succumb to that fear. In 1948, with a strong civil rights platform, Truman wins re-election. By electing Truman, voters seemed to affirm that supporting civil rights was no longer political suicide.
Harry Truman was elected without the votes of 4 southern states. And it became even more obvious at that point that the South was on the losing side in this battle to retain segregation.
Jackie Robinson opens the Dodgers' second with a home run into the left field seats. The Brooks, who clinched the pennant on the final day of the season, beating out the...
Even as the South resists, racial barriers fall throughout the nation. In 1947, Jackie Robinson breaks through the color line in baseball. Black actors break the stereotypical mold in which they have been traditionally cast and portrayed real human beings. And the United States Supreme Court declares segregation on interstate buses and trains unconstitutional. For Thurgood Marshall, now the chief attorney for the NAACP, The time has finally come to strike directly at the heart of legal segregation. Marshall looks for black families in a few local communities courageous enough to sue for integrated schools in the federal courts. In 1951, the NAACP unexpectedly discovers one of those communities in Farmville, Virginia, deep in the tobacco-growing region of Prince Edward County.
The black community in Farmville, Virginia in the 1950s, in the late 40s, was an ambitious community. And it seemed that, in fact, you know, the public school system was what I refer to as a great engine. The black public schools were a great engine of achievement and ambition on the part of students.
I credit where I am today to what I got in high school. I didn't need an integrated education. I didn't need an integrated student body to get a good education. Our teachers, I mean, they were on us all the time. It wasn't about sitting beside a given person. It was about a quality education, and we could no longer get the quality education we needed in this building because we had grown out of the building.
We never saw the white schools inside.
I had no idea what the high school was like. And when I walked over there, and this still blows my mind, they had like an atrium in the center of the school. We could walk out of the cafeteria and kind of sit in a garden and eat. Damn, we didn't even have a cafeteria, let alone where you could go after you got your food. But, you know, the wide halls, the building was just absolutely gorgeous. And I just couldn't believe that this is what they had for a building. And I'm sitting up there with an umbrella up on rainy days so the ink wouldn't run on my paper.
It's just really difficult to kind of know how to think about yourself when you can't go to the public school because you're not good enough, when you can't get basic services because you're not good enough. This kind of psychic harm. I mean, there's a lot of real economic harms and physical harms, but it's the psychic harm that really makes you begin to disrespect yourself.
As the black population of Farmville increased, instead of a new school, the students were housed in tar paper shacks.
We just didn't have the facilities that was really necessary. And sometimes the teachers would take the kids on the school bus. Take them on the school bus and teach a class.
We decided to try to get adequate facilities for our kids through petition. And I remember very specifically, one board member looked at it and said, if we build a school like that, every Tom, Dick, and Harry be going to school. And that was the first time it ever really dawned upon me that actually it wasn't an intention for us to go to school.
In the first place, the school board didn't want us there. They didn't like any type of protest to what they were doing because they thought that they were doing right, and they always specified we're doing according to Virginia laws.
Because whites believed in gradualism. They called it gradualism in those days, so forth. Things will change, just give us time. And it has been suggested, you know, about 300 years. How much time do you need?
We wanted so much here and had so little. And we had talents and abilities here that weren't really being realized. And I thought that was a tragic shame. And that's basically what motivated me to want to see some change take place here.
In 1951, Barbara Johns, then a 16-year-old junior and niece of activist Reverend Vernon Johns, decides to organize a student strike at the Robert Russa Moulton High School.
There wasn't any fear. I just felt, this is your moment, seize it.
Barbara had decided, she and the other student leaders had decided that this is what they were going to do. They were going to get a representative from each grade and have that person be responsible for telling the other students. and she emphasized that we should keep it a secret.
Mr. Jones was the principal. We had to get him off campus because we knew if Mr. Jones was on campus, there was no way there was going to be a strike. He was a very strong leader and very highly respected man. So we went home and we pretended we were businessmen calling in, telling him that some students were downtown making disturbances, and would he please come down and take care of it. When one of us saw him, then that person called the other two and said, well, he's gone, and we all came, and the three of us came back to the campus.
When we got to the assembly, Barbara came in and walked up on the stage, and I remember saying to myself, what is going on? Why is she up there? And she started to talk, and she was talking so forcefully, and she told us about how the conditions were very bad at the school, and you know, she needed everyone's cooperation, and she realized this was a surprise, but they had to keep it that way so that it wouldn't leak, and that only a few people knew about it.
Barbara started out, of course, and then we just talked and told them, strike the school.
And it became a cheering session. What do you want to do? We want to strike. When do you want to strike? Today, you know, and all this. So it really was a rallying situation.
I remember sitting in my seat and sort of cowering down because I couldn't believe it, first of all. First reaction I had was fear. I thought, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to us now?
Everyone, a lot of people were scared. Some of Barbara's closest friends were scared to death for her. They said, why did you do that? She says, we have to make a change. And I mean right now. You know, Barbara was very dynamic when she wasn't quiet.
The students marched down the street to the superintendent's office.
We come in the office, and this poor secretary almost had a heart attack. So she goes, tells Mr. McElwain that these students are here, so we go in his office. He promised he was going to rain down the wrath of God on all of us for what we were doing, and our parents were going to lose their jobs.
He said, you're upstarts. And you know, you need to go ahead back to school before all your parents are in jail. And this is what frightened us when he said our parents are going to jail. And a member of my family says, how big is the Farmville jail? And that was it. From that point on, there was no stopping for us.
The initial reaction was to cut off the economic livelihood of folk, and that, of course, was going to bring them in line. And, you know, Mr. Jones, the principal, was fired. Mama was fired, and Daddy was fired.
Our cross was burned in our yard after the school strike, and my parents sent Barbara to Montgomery, Alabama to live with my Uncle Vernon because they were afraid for her life, because they had received threats.
Responding to the crisis, NAACP lawyers come to Farmville to assess the resolve of the community.
It was just like my watching Jackie Robinson in Ebbsfield. It was the most beautiful sight I've ever seen. And they came in there, and they were really and truly behind us. They were astounded to find that these people who had been dormant and quiet for so long were ready to back their children. Then, of course, Spotswood Robinson spoke up. And he says, if you're really ready to back them, then you have to sign this petition. And that's when we found out how we could separate the wheat from the chaff in the black community, because some of the blacks didn't sign. As you know, my mother and father signed.
The NAACP takes up the students' cause, adding the Farmville case to a series of suits that will take the Russa Moulton Students' Challenge to Jim Crow all the way to the United States Supreme Court. It was the culmination of a 20-year legal campaign. In 1934, the NAACP's chief legal counsel, Charles Hamilton Houston, had realized that the battle against Jim Crow had to be fought in the courts, that only through a change in the constitutional interpretation of civil rights could the separate but equal justification for segregation be brought to an end. With this new strategy, Houston and Thurgood Marshall had aimed squarely at the heart of Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 ruling that had made legal segregation possible. On May 17, 1954, Houston's vision became a reality. In a case known as Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court upheld the Farmville students' claim for better schools. Speaking for the unanimous court, Chief Justice Earl Warren declared, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place."
I think, believe it or not, we had the idealism of American young people about America. And I think that that was a very important, compelling and driving force in the way that these Prince Edward Blacks faced the world. That we saw our history as in evolving into the American story in some way.
The best moment was in 1954 when the Supreme Court overturned segregation in schools. That was the best moment. All the rest of it went for that. Even though when we started, we didn't start for that, but that was the best moment.
When I heard about the historic decision, I said, thank God. Thank God. At last, someone has listened to us. And those were my very words. Someone has listened to us. Hopefully, we shall see a change.
For over 80 years, Jim Crow was a symbol of white supremacy, of black subjugation in America. But another symbol of black America emerged in the lives of men and women who fought battles great and small. Some wrote their page in history with words, others with the blues. Some risked death to find and print the truth. Some proved their worth on the battlefield, some in the classroom or the courtroom, and some in a neighbor's backyard. Some gave up the hope of change in their lifetime for the promise of a better life for their children. And some of their children acted to make that life possible. Fueled by the Supreme Court decision, the voices of Farmville will become a chorus. The chorus, a battle cry. Within a decade, the civil rights movement will pour out into the streets of the South and into the courts of America. Risking, sometimes losing their lives, activists, black and white, break down racial barriers all over the South. But the racism that gave birth to Jim Crow still runs deep in American life. And the struggle to overcome it is not and may never be over. But for those who continue to struggle, they can draw strength and inspiration from the men and women who did not stay silent, but stood up in the time of Jim Crow.
The tragic era of Jim Crow comes to life at PBS Online with interactive activities and first-hand accounts. Find details on key people, events, and more at pbs.org. Major funding for the rise and fall of Jim Crow is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding America's understanding for more than 30 years of who we were, who we are, and who we will be. and by support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people. Additional funding is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. New York Life.
Today should be better than yesterday. Tomorrow should be even greater. This idea inspired a movement, and New York Life salutes the vision and bravery of those who improved our nation and our world.